Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today, on the occasion of the International Women's Day, we will talk about why do patriarchal economic systems survive and feminist economics. And I'm particularly happy to have Nancy Folbre as a guest to discuss this topic with me. Nancy is Professor Emerita of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her research explores the interface between political economy and feminist theory, with a particular emphasis on the value of unpaid care work. Nancy, thank you so much for making the time to join us at The Sound of Economics.
Super happy to be here.
Your latest book, The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems, you have examined the contradictory effects of capitalist development and explained why the work of caring for others is undervalued and under-rewarded in today's global economy, calling attention to the organization of childbearing, the care of other dependents, and the inheritance of assets. Appending conventional definition of the economy based only on the market, you emphasize the production of human capabilities in families and communities and the social reproduction of group solidarities. We're going to explore further about all those things, but before diving more into this, you are one of the pioneering economists in the area of feminist economics. What is the paradigmatic framework behind feminist economics, and how has the discipline evolved since you helped institutionalize it?
That's a good question because it is still evolving. But from my perspective, the starting point is the recognition that women have some collective interests as women. Those aren't the only collective interests they have, but women often act together as a group to advocate for changes in social institutions, including law and public policy, that would serve their collective interests. And the importance of care work, of reproduction, of social reproduction, whatever you want to call it, is especially important for women because women take on a disproportionate share of the responsibility for it, both in paid work and in unpaid work. And so bringing that work to the fore and making it visible and assigning at least a minimum value to it is really, really important. And there's a third aspect of the feminist paradigm that I think is really important to recognize, and it flows very naturally from this emphasis on care work, and that is that we can't organize an economy based purely on the pursuit of self-interest, that without a pretty high level of concern for other people and for future generations, we're pretty much doomed.
And do you see, if for our listeners that might not be that familiar with the theoretical development, if you would describe, in a nutshell, what has been going on in the past few decades, where was the starting point, theoretically speaking, and where are we now?
Well, feminist economics has a really long history dating back to the 19th century. And I've actually written about it in another book called Greed, Lust, and Gender, A History of Economic Ideas. It tends to kind of ebb and flow, wax and wane over time, but it's been continually gaining credibility and gaining kind of traction, especially within the economics discipline. So feminist economists got together and formed an international association. More than 20 years ago, we have a very good journal, Feminist Economics, that's highly rated and I think has had a big impact. And one really important impact that I think we've also had is on the development of national time use surveys that provide a pretty good description of how much time people devote to unpaid work. And of course, that too is still evolving and a lot of work remains to be done. But most European countries, as well as many developing countries now, conduct regular time use surveys, so we can say with some precision how much time is devoted to caring for children, doing housework, tending to the elderly, sick, etc.
Going a bit more into your work, you've been focusing extensively on the patriarchal mode of production. How would you define patriarchy? What's the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy?
Yeah, actually, I really try to avoid using the noun patriarchy or the term patriarchal mode of production. I think it makes more sense to talk about patriarchal institutions, because I think all of the societies, all of the economic systems that we inhabit are kind of a hybrid of different hierarchical systems that are kind of laid on top of each other and often interacting and co-evolving. So, I make the same arguments about capitalist and capitalism. I think we should talk about capitalist institutions because there's so much variation within the current global economy that just to call it a capitalist economy is meaningless. And interactions with gender and race and also with national identity, citizenship, nationality are also really important. So that's really one of the most important themes of my book, that we want to think about kind of hybrid, complex, overlaid, interacting forms of inequality, of which gender is a very important one.
We're going to come into a second on this hybrid intersectionality within your work, but coming back to then the definition of patriarchal institutions, if we move from model production to the institutional approach which you are proposing, how exactly would you define then a patriarchal institution?
I see patriarchal institutions as those that fail to deliver equal rights to women relative to men, relative to elder men in particular, and also as systems that impose greater social obligations on women than on men. So I don't think we can stay completely within the discourse of rights. You can give women the same rights as men, but if you don't give men the same obligations as women for the care of others, it's very hard for those rights to have a meaningful impact.
And when you speak about this multi-layered approach, you argue that adjectives such as patriarchal, capitalist, racist, and nationalist describe sets of social institutions that mutually influence one another. And you've been calling for a theoretical tool to understand this, which you define as an intersectional political economy. Could you explain what such an intersectional political economy is and why it matters?
Sure. It really comes back to the concept of collective interests, which are often based on collective identity. And most of us are assigned a social identity. We don't choose it. We have some limited ability to change it. Nothing is completely fixed, but we're generally assigned a citizenship, a gender, a race, according to some social definitions. And often what that means is that many of us are in contradictory positions. Like we might live in a very affluent country, but be in a very relatively poor position within that country. Or we might be a woman, but inhabit a very privileged class position or race position. And so when we make strategic decisions about what kind of policies we want to support and how we want to act in the political arena, we have a lot of competing allegiances that we have to mediate and decide. And often they're linked in very positive ways. For instance, in the U.S., the political movement for civil rights based on race really strengthened and contributed to the feminist movement in the U.S. But there are all sorts of other interactions between these dimensions of group identity. And I think one implication is that we tend to see stronger feminist movements in countries that are relatively affluent and have feminist movements to be stronger when there's less racial, ethnic heterogeneity. And there are kind of trade-offs. People often find themselves kind of in a situation where they have something to gain from maintenance of the status quo, but they might also have something to gain from a political change. And kind of, what their priorities are may depend on their perceptions of how other people are mobilizing collectively.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was just wondering, you mentioned very rightly so the way the civil rights movement in the United States has been reinforcing and strengthening the feminist movement, and I would say also LGBTQ movements and so forth.
Exactly.
So there is a dialogue within the movements, which is intersectional. On the other hand, I question myself, or ask myself the question, when looking at the relation or the complex relations between capitalism and those kind of movements, which is sometimes of opposition, for other times, I would say some sort of strategy of co-optation, if I may use this word, where capitalism somehow co-opts LGBTQ rights narratives or feminist narratives, or you name it, in a way which is somehow hollowing out the revolutionary aspect of those movements. If you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's somehow extending the market to, extending or considering those movements as potential markets or new markets, rather than ideologies or like movements, activists, contributions, which actually are meant to change the system, like some sort of use to reproduce the capitalist system instead of making a change from within.
Well, you're making this assumption that I challenged from the outset, that we live in a capitalist system and that class dynamics are really the primary dynamics capable of co-optation. And I think that is kind of incomplete. I think class interests are really important, but it's also true that class wealth, the class ownership, is very concentrated in a demographic group that is largely white and male, and which has interests based on their race and gender and citizenship. So yes, there's always potential for co-optation, but it's not limited to class. That's what intersectionality implies, is that you're privileged in some ways and you're disadvantaged in others. And so people are sort of constantly sort of striking a bargain that's kind of based on this complexity. Like, you might be a wage earner in a very rich country where there's a lot of rapid economic growth, and you think, well, geez, this is a pretty good deal for me, so I'm not going to engage in class struggle because I'm in a pretty good position citizenship-wise, right? But, it can also work the other way, with any dimension, like you see now the emergence of a pretty strong professional managerial class among women in the US, and that has divided the feminist movement because it's weakened gender solidarity in a way by heightening class divisions. So the bottom line is that people are not always going to, if you think about voting, which is not that voting is always the most important action, but that we have a lot of evidence of important shifts in voting patterns over the last few years, with the rise of kind of populism and nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And if you look at voting, people are not always voting their class interests. They're not always voting their gender interests. They're not always voting their racial interests. They're trying to calculate how all of these sets of interests are going to be affected, and often kind of waiting to see where other people are moving and where the potential for a coalition might lie that could work to their advantage. So instead of spending a lot of time looking at polls or election results and arguing about which is more important, class or race or gender or religion or other things, we need to understand that these allegiances are shifting and unstable and kind of strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. And one important topic of your research has been the attention to unpaid care work, specifically as an example of the limitations that we have in classical economy of just looking at waged work and, in general, monetary transactions. And you basically enlarge the scope. That's very interesting also, theoretically speaking, about your approach to political economy, to enlarge the scope of what is considered within the economic realm, right? Specifically your work on unpaid work is particularly affecting women, and how do you think it does affect the economy and society at large. And what policy solutions would you recommend for for unpaid labor contributions?
Well, first of all, there's now a lot of really good empirical work providing alternative estimates of economic output called extended income or satellite accounts. And that this is a really high priority because over the past century, we've really mismeasured our improvement in our living standards because, when women have gone from doing unpaid work to paid work, that increases GDP, gross domestic product, market output, right? But it reduces the amount of unpaid work that's being done. And those don't necessarily cancel each other out, but completely, but they clearly have an effect. Plus, there are a lot of intangible elements of unpaid work that have to do with the maintenance of family life and community life that are not really assigned any value at all. And I think we've seen, as a result of the single-minded focus on market output, we've seen a kind of deterioration of the social climate. And I think the concept of social climate is really useful because it's really a parallel with the physical climate. It's complicated, it's hard to understand, it seems to be getting less stable, less predictable, and it's going to be very costly if we don't figure out how to really, maintain it effectively. So in terms of policy, what that means is paying more attention to public goods, things that are not necessarily priced in the market, whether that's physical environment, extinction of species, destabilization of climate, air pollution, or whether it's levels of crime, levels of drug addiction, levels of suicide, levels of economic and social misery, as it were. So we really need to change the scorecard, base it on a longer list of outcomes than just the dollar value of GDP.
Yeah, this comes also with maybe another reflection, even more precise. Obviously, the views or like the solutions from your side of the Atlantic and our side of the Atlantic might be working differently, but still, because when it comes to the issue of care work, for example, giving a specific look into the evolution of welfare systems, how do you see your work translated into policy recommendations, if we might want to try this exercise?
Well, I think we need a different cost-benefit analysis than we usually use. We need to recognize the value of improving and developing people's capabilities. We need to recognize kind of the intangible elements that contribute to our families and communities. And all of these things are public goods in the sense that they're not priced, they're not bought and sold in the market. And so having a better accounting system for the value of public goods and explaining to people how public provision is actually, it's not a cost, it's an investment. It's not a form of consumption, it's a form of investment that actually promotes sustainable economic growth. And, I think this notion that welfare is a drag on economic growth or that, social spending is just a waste, just throwing money away that could have been spent better elsewhere is just really mistaken. And that actually the social costs that result from a lot of inequality and a lot of economic privation are really pretty serious.
Do you think that in the States, what especially in some European countries has been experienced and experimented in the past decades, can be inspirational, or do you think that completely different models could be thought, which maybe go beyond what we have traditionally developed in some of the countries, especially the Nordic countries here in Europe?
In my view, the really big challenge to kind of welfare state policies is the whole area of immigration policy. And in order to get people together to invest in public goods, they have to have something in common. They have to share some common ideals, and they have to have some common interests. And because we have been so preoccupied with the development and enforcement of national boundaries, and because we are relying on an economic system that basically pits workers against each other in competition for good jobs, we've now seen a kind of really serious threat to the continued provision of public benefits that's based on big differences in living standards between people in poor countries and people in rich countries. So I don't think there's a simple policy solution, but I think a better understanding of these dynamics is really crucial to developing a better policy. And I think, right now Europe is experiencing, a big increase in kind of heterogeneity that is going to push it in the direction of the US, that is towards less generous public provision. But I think that's a wrong turn that will prove very costly for all of us.
And still, because we don't have too much time, but we still have time for one last question, which I would like to broaden it up a little bit, still on the policy side, because we touched upon the theory of intersectional political economy, and I think that it's pretty going to the core of revising the way we see costs, benefits, who pays for what, and many, and of course, the hierarchy and power relations within economic systems and political systems and social systems. How do you see the political changes and economic system changes that would be needed to tackle the many forms of socially constructed inequality?
Yeah, it's a circular problem. The reason I think that it feels very intractable is that in order to encourage cooperation, we need less inequality. But in order to get less inequality, we need more cooperation. So I think once a country goes down this path of increased polarization, it's hard to reverse it. And I guess my view is that an important tool of persuasion is just the fact that we are now globally facing problems that really can't be solved by the market and that really require cooperation. So if we don't reduce inequality sufficiently to restore some modicum of cooperation, we're all going to suffer. So that's a pretty big and abstract insight, but I think it could be, I think what's useful about it is that it appeals to people's own collective interests in their future lives and those of their children to really reorient our economic priorities.
Well, indeed. So basically, it all matters if we have the conscience and the awareness that there is a collective stake.
Yeah.
In order to act together and to put in motion this awareness of collective stake and awareness of the need for cooperation. You need to reduce inequalities, but it's a very hard wheel. If I understand from what you're saying, it's very hard wheel to set in motion.
Yeah. On the other hand, climate change is happening. It's inexorable at this point, and I think it is going to force a pretty serious rethinking of public policy on many levels. Either we'll learn from it and cope with it, or we won't.
Indeed. And on this big question, which of course we could keep discussing for much longer, I unfortunately have to say that we have to stop the conversation because that's all the time we have for this episode. But I would like to once again, Nancy, thank you so much for your insights. And in the show notes, we are going to put a couple of references about your works so that our listeners can dive a little bit deeper into those concepts. And I would like to remind everyone also, as usual, that you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks again for joining The Sounds of Economics, and thanks to our listeners for following us. Until the next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.